Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Phil Harrington, and for my sins, I'm the organiser of tonight's meeting. And I have to think that we have to blame the Seabreeze Cafe for this, because Kim happened to be a regular at the Seabreeze Cafe, and I was a regular there as well, and we ran into each other several times, and I knew Kim from the university, and I knew she had a great story to tell. And when we talked about a possibility of a Fabian's event, she knew how to not only say yes, but also how to bring more gravitas to it by inviting colleagues from the community. And I'm incredibly impressed with the panel we've got for you tonight, and the detail and depth of advocacy that we're going to have for something which is just fundamentally a right for all us New Zealand citizens to expect, and which we know we are not getting at all from our current political environment. So it gives me great pleasure to say that tonight's panel is not only a very important one, but also incredibly powerful in terms of its leadership and the speakers we have. I have to say before we go much further that I deeply, deeply apologise for the rigmarole that was involved in having a venue, then not a venue, then another venue, then coming back to this venue, and that, I know it would have pissed you off, it pissed me off, but it is one of these things that comes across from time to time, mainly called life. Having said that, I'd like to get underway, and I think, Kim, you want to be the opening speaker, and can I welcome Kim and look forward to what she has to say. The format tonight will be each of the presenters will say their piece, and then at the end of the evening we'll have a break, we'll have some time for some questions and answers, and then we'll have some time to meet the audience personally if you wish. And because this is a Fabian's event and we record it and we upload it onto YouTube, we're going to have a microphone system so that people who ask questions can be recorded and they will be heard, so that it's not lost when it becomes part of the YouTube presentation. So welcome, Kim. Thank you so much.
Right, we'll tip that right down. This talk is called 1,000 Gaps for Victims of Crime and the Need to Set Up a Victims Commission and Build an Infrastructure to Keep Victims Safe. Kia ora rangatira mā, no mai haere mai. Ko Waiaho, ko Glen Lyon te Monga, ko Lakteita Awa, ko NAC te Waka, ko McGregor te iwi, ko Kim McGregor toka wingua. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I want to thank you, Phil, for allowing me to speak this evening. My reason for speaking tonight is to describe to you some of the gaps in the system for victims of crime, some of the recent progress made and lost, and what I believe we need to do to improve victims' safety and ensure that their rights are implemented. The criminal justice system is an uphill battle for victims of crime, especially for victims of gender-based violence. The structure of the system has made the victim a bystander to the process, because a millennium ago, victims exchanged their right to seek direct vengeance against those who harmed them in return for the state taking over the responsibility for the investigation, prosecution, and compensation for wrongdoing. With this exchange, while victims no longer had to bear the burden of the cost of taking private prosecutions, it also meant that with the state now taking the case against the accused, the victim's role effectively shifted to being merely a witness to the state's case. This shift meant that the victim no longer has their own lawyer, as the accused has, a lawyer they can instruct and who can advise and protect them. It also effectively has meant that while the state prosecutors do meet with victims to discuss their role as a witness, it is common for prosecutors to be concerned not to spend too much time with victims in case the prosecutor is accused of coaching the witness. It is important to remember within this exchange, Government also has accepted the responsibility for supporting victims through the system and helping them recover from the harm that the state should have protected them from in the first place. The basis of our current victims' rights started off in 1985, when New Zealand signed the United Nations Declaration of Basic Principles of Justice for Victims of Crime and Abuse of Power. Then, in 1987, government introduced the Victims of Offences Act, which stated that victims should be treated with courtesy and compassion, have access to support services, make a victim impact statement, express their views on bail, and be notified when an offender escapes or is released from custody. These entitlements, however, were not obligatory. Around this time, the Victims Task Force began. It was set to meet for 5 years, and it delivered its final report in 1993. The report gave many excellent recommendations, including that victims needed a watchdog to protect their rights. That watchdog has never been set up, and so I continue to call for that watchdog in the form of a Victims Commission, and I'll explain why. Our most recent Victims' Rights Act was established in 2002. This Act strengthened the provision of the Victims of Offences Act, including by putting victims' views on bail and information about the harm they suffered before the judge. The Act also placed an obligation on government agencies to implement victims' rights. But then it also placed a statutory bar, preventing victims from financial compensation for any breaches of their rights. In 2009, the Ministry of Justice carried out a review of victims' rights. This review found that victims were generally unaware of their rights and that they had difficulty accessing information about the criminal justice system and what support services were available to them. In response, the Ministry of Justice set up the Victims Information website and established the Victims Information Line within the Ministry of Justice's brand new Victims Centre. The terms of reference for the Victims Centre was inspirational. The centre was to be developed with Māori and be the front door for all victims to help with their questions, connect them within the system, and have their complaints triaged. Within a few years, however, the victims' phone line had been outsourced to victim support, and in the Ministry of Justice, there were just 1 or 2 untrained staff left to manage the very few victim emails that were able to find their way into the rundown Victim Centre. The Victims' Rights Act of 2002 was strengthened and broadened in 2014 by the Victims' Rights Amendment Act. The 2014 Act also required that the Ministry of Justice develop a Victims' Code. The Victims' Code was designed to help victims know their rights and to whom they could complain. But the Code, like the Act, did not make victims' rights legally enforceable, and there are no sanctions for any failures of government agencies if they do not comply. And unfortunately, after experiencing similar internal neglect to the Victim Centre, once released, the Victims' Code quickly disappeared from view, having no staff responsible to maintain its distribution. So let me recap just the victims' position at this point. Victims are not a represented party in the legal system. They are relegated to being merely a witness to the state's case against the accused. The state is responsible for supporting a victim through the system, but if the state does not fully implement the few victims' rights that victims have, or they breach a victim's rights, there are no sanctions against government agencies because victims' rights are not legally enforceable. And finally, there is no independent victims' rights watchdog to oversee that victims' rights are fully implemented. What could possibly go wrong? My opportunity to work on this complex problem began when I was appointed to be the inaugural Chief Victims Advisor to Government by the Honourable Amy Adams in November 2015. I was in that role for 9 years until the end of last year. During my term, I served 6 ministers of justice and several other ministers of police, of courts, as well as the new Minister for the Prevention of Family Violence and Sexual Violence. Prior to taking up this role, while I had supported hundreds of raped adults and children over the previous 30 years through police statements, forensic medical examinations, through courts, or as a therapist, I had never had the opportunity to look within government at the justice system before. The role I began in was tiny. It was a tiny 0.3 position, which is a day and a half a week, with 2 staff and with a massive term of reference to improve not only the criminal justice system for all victims, including victims of burglary, assault, serious fraud, sexual violence, family violence, and homicide. It also included considering victims in the youth justice system, and my role was also to cover the civil jurisdiction, the family court. It was largely an academic role based on the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor, and so over my term I provided ministers with 17 victim-focused reports highlighting systems gaps and offering solutions. When I first started in the role, media asked me what my first job would be. I told them I would start with a baseline review of victims' justice needs and I would work from there. I assumed that this review would only take me a matter of months. Little did I know that I would be working from an internal ground zero level of knowledge about victims' justice needs. This meant that my baseline review took much longer. I say I started from a ground zero level because my first question to my 2 officials were, how many victims are in the justice system? How long have they been in the system? And what are their justice needs? My officials couldn't tell me answers to these questions, so then I asked them, well, what data do you collect on victims? They couldn't answer that either, so I said, well, okay, that's where we start. The first report I commissioned showed that it was impossible to collect information on victims' movements across the justice system because the justice agencies, police, Ministry of Justice, courts, corrections and parole board, all have separate IT systems, none of which were joined together. Also, victims did not have a unique identifier, so we couldn't easily track a victim's journey through the justice system to find out what is and isn't working well for them. My second report outlined each of the government agencies' responsibility for implementing the 10 rights for victims of serious harm, and asked to what extent these rights were upheld by police, Ministry of Justice, Crown Law, and the Department of Corrections. The 10 victims' rights included the victim being informed about the police investigation and court proceedings, victims giving their views on the offender's application for bail and name suppression, the victim's right to be informed about the release of the offender on bail, the right of the victim to give their view on the impact of the offending, and be informed about the offender post-sentencing. The conclusion of my second paper was that it is not possible to know what percentage of victims have their rights upheld compared to those who do not, because agencies either have the systems in place to collect the relevant data, but for resourcing and staff reasons they do not, or the systems in place did not enable staff to collect the relevant data. What my second report also told us is that after over 20 years of passing the Victims' Rights Act 2002, when justice agencies had been obligated to implement victims' rights, the agencies have not prioritised the monitoring of the compliance with the Act. Monitoring victims' rights raises a number of safety concerns. With bail decisions, for example, we know that it is vital that victims of gender-based violence in particular are fully consulted about the risks posed to them when decisions are being made of if and where it is safe to place an accused on bail in the community. Without this data, we do not know how many victims have their views on bail collected, and it is impossible to determine the number of bail hearings where judges are deciding whether to grant bail in the absence of the victim's view. We also have no idea how many victims are informed of an offender's release back into the community compared with those who are not informed. I did find out that there are thousands of victims who could be on the Victims Notification Register but are not, and thousands of victims who are entitled to reparation but cannot be found because their contact details were lost years before. And so, based on this and the many victims' complaints I received over my time, I have no doubt that victims' rights are not fully implemented. Here are just two examples of the potential impacts when victims are not told about the offender's release from custody. One woman only found out her violent ex-partner had been released from court that day when, within the hour of his release, he had broken into her home and was holding a knife to her neck. Another complaint that came to me was from a 12-year-old girl who was shocked when, in her local library, she bumped into the man who had sexually abused her. She had no idea he had been released from custody. After that incident, her mother reported that the child no longer felt safe anywhere in her community and stopped going to school. Before I begin to give more of an overview of victims' complaints about the system, I must emphasise that although I will likely sound very critical of the justice system from a victim's perspective, my intention is not to criticise individuals who work within that system, such as police, court staff, corrections staff, lawyers, or the judiciary. Many police, court staff, and others in the criminal justice workforce go above and beyond to try to make victims safe and give them the vital support they need. It is the offender-centric, adversarial system with a lack of a victims-focused infrastructure that fails victims. Despite the multiple system drawbacks from victims, when victims are provided with the right levels of safety and support, and they get the information they need at the right time, the system can work well. Several victims have told me that just knowing they were believed by the police and that the police did everything in their power to support them, and the victim had been well prepared and supported by the court victim advisors and independent court support personnel, having this wraparound level of support allowed these victims to go through the system and go into court feeling strong and able to give their testimonies with confidence. These cases, even if the outcome was a not guilty verdict, many victims, including child victims, said they still felt proud that they had done everything they could to stop the person who harmed them from going on to harm others and to make the person accountable for the harm they caused. These are some of the more positive accounts from victims. Unfortunately, based on perception surveys and other reports over decades, these positive accounts are not the majority. When I began consulting victims of crime directly, I saw their tears, I heard their fears, anger, and frustration. They talked about the lack of fairness and the lack of justice they experienced in our justice system. They told us that the system was offender-centric and not victim-centric. And in a survey I ran with 620 participants, 83% told us that they do not feel safe in the system, 79% said they do not have enough information or support, and 77% said the victim does not listen to their views, concerns, or needs. They told us that victims' justice needs were not recognised and that there was insufficient knowledge in the justice workforce of victims' rights and needs. Overall, support services were not easily accessible, integrated, or tailored to help people heal from victimisation, and there were few prevention initiatives to stop victims being re-victimised. Maori victims of crime told us that the system does not work for whānau, hapu, or iwi, and that there needs to be a recognition of tītiriti o Waitangi. They said the system needs to make room for an iwi perspective, tikanga Maori processes, and kaupapa Maori models of healing. And while there were complaints of insufficient knowledge of the justice needs for victims of gender-based violence, there was reportedly even less knowledge of the justice needs for victims who were Maori, child victims, victims with disabilities, victims from the rainbow community, victims when English was not their second language, and for male victims of sexual and interpersonal violence. The lack of knowledge was even greater for victims who belonged to more than one of these cohorts. Through listening intensely, I came to fully understand that there was a crisis of confidence in the justice system from a victim's perspective. My understanding was based on a wide range of factors, beginning with the low rate of reported crime. We know that only about a quarter of victims report crimes committed against them. This reduces to less than 20% for crimes of family violence and less than 10% for victims of sexual violence. And it was no surprise that of those victims who had been through the criminal justice system, many would advise other victims not to report crime. Often they concluded that their justice outcomes were not worth their efforts to try to keep themselves and others safe. And unfortunately, some victims even reported that the justice system harmed them further. Some victims of sexual violence, for example, whose complaints made it through the very high attrition rates to get to criminal court, many of whom waited for 2 or more years to get to trial, with the case being rescheduled multiple times and at the last minute during those years. Then, after all of that, they experienced brutal cross-examinations that they were shocked by, and sometimes the cross-examination went on for days. This left some victims reporting that they felt that they were the ones on trial. It was their behaviour that was scrutinised and their character that was questioned, while the accused was able to sit with their right to silence as their defence lawyer, in the victim's words, tore them apart. Some rape survivors reported that the defence lawyer's accusations that they were lying or consented to the violation would ring in their ears for the rest of their lives. What seemed to be even more brutal was hearing about cases when women or girls had been pack raped, and each of the men accused of rape had their own lawyer to cross-examine the victim in turn. One woman was cross-examined for 5 days by 5 very experienced defence lawyers. None of the 5 men were cross-examined. So it's not surprising to hear some victims saying that the justice system was worse than the abuse they experienced in the first place. Disturbingly also, some victims told me that the justice system literally made them want to kill themselves. Now, while victims absolutely accept that their evidence should be tested, it is the hostile way they are cross-examined that they object to. The outcome of victims not feeling safe enough or confident enough in the system to report crime is incredibly serious, especially if we as a country wish to end harmful behaviours and strive for a country that is safe for all of us. We need victims to report crime. Ultimately, victims do not ask for a lot from the justice system, but what they do ask for is more fairness, and they and I believe that strengthening victims' rights does not need to come at the expense of the accused losing any of their rights. After listening to victims intensely during my term and having looked at what efforts have been made and failed to improve the criminal justice system for victims, I concluded that any meaningful transformation for victims was unlikely without 2 things: an internal body within government that is accountable for actively improving victims' experiences across the justice system, and 2, an independent victim-focused mechanism such as a victims' commission that is set up as a watchdog to monitor victim safety and rights implementation and provide a continuous system improvement feedback loop. While I presented these and my other recommendations in my report to Tangi o Te Manawa Nui, Recommendations for Reform, in a parliamentary breakfast in December 2019, it still took a couple more years of my very active internal advocacy, particularly with the Secretary of Justice, the Police Commissioner, and the Head of Corrections, for them to not only understand the impact of the huge infrastructure gaps for victims, but for these leaders to finally realise it was vital for them to act and fix these gaps. So to address the missing infrastructure, I was absolutely delighted when in 2022, the Minister of Justice, Chris Farfoy, and the Chief Executives all pushed for and were successful in getting a joint budget bid of $45.7 million to begin to build an infrastructure for victims through a massive work program called the Better Outcomes for Victims. Job done, I thought. They appointed an excellent director for the Better Outcomes for Victims work, and the design and planning of the 4-year work program began. Sadly, the momentum for this did not last long. The Ministry of Justice, Chris Farfoy, resigned, and the new minister decided that rather than put millions of dollars into building an infrastructure for victims, half the money would be repurposed to go into areas such as the Victim Assistance Scheme and to victim support. Despite this, and with only half the budget, we began to focus on building a safe infrastructure for victims. Within the first year, the Better Outcomes for Victims work program, the director had organised multiple teams totalling about 100 officials across the justice system, all focused on improving different parts of the system for victims. Then everything was put on hold in 2023 when the election was held. As you all know, I'm sure, when there is a change of government, most of the work programs are paused until the new government sifts through the existing work to see if their work fits with their priorities. The new government's initial priority for victims in 2023 was mostly focused on speeding up trials, which of course is an important goal. But the momentum in the Better Outcomes for Victims work was paused for another year. Then as I was leaving the role at the end of 2024, there were 5 to 6 smaller key initiatives from the Better Outcomes for Victims work that were to be continued. 5 or 6 small initiatives is not enough to transform a system, and it will not improve the overall system for victims. Apart from these small initiatives, the 100 officials were mostly redirected to other priorities, particularly in the youth justice space. As I left the role, I was extremely pleased, however, that the new government at least continued the role of the Chief Victims Advisor, and the person who replaced me is a strong victims advocate. So I very much hope that in the near future there will be some sort of reset of the Better Outcomes for Victims work program in some form or other. So in summary, having looked at the history and the initiatives for victims, I still want those 2 things. I want to see an enduring government cross-party agreement that supports the setting up of a very senior team that is permanently accountable for improving victims' rights implementation. The work of this team should be to build a victims' infrastructure across the siloed justice system to address the 1,000 gaps for victims. The work must have sustained resources and will need to include a system that can measure and monitor victims' rights implementation. And the second part, an independent bicultural Victims Commission that is victim-friendly, designed to listen to victims and use their experiences for continuous system learning, that needs to be set up as an independent watchdog for victim safety and the implementation of their rights. Thank you for allowing me to share my hopes for possible improvements for the rights of victims of crime in the justice system. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. That was incredibly valuable. I really appreciate the continuing responsibility you're feeling as an advocate, as a person with a sense of service to a job that still needs so much work to be done. And I really appreciate the depth of knowledge you have and what you brought to that discussion tonight. And thank you so much for what you contributed. And can I then move to Janet? Janet, you're Professor of Public Health, Janet? Population Health, who will also speak on the theme. Thank you, Jim. Sorry, I was trying to read off that.
That's okay. I think it's the different presentation team, the one with the blue slides.
Do we have the other slide put on the projector?
And I am just going to grab the click.
You're going up here.
Yeah. However, the presentation that's showing belongs to Denise at the moment. So I'm looking for the slides with the blue background, please. Thanks for your patience. It's always the technical stuff, right? That's all right. You can have a little wiggle and and a breathe and all of that. That's the one. Perfect. Thank you. Perfect. All right. So kia ora koutou katoa. So my name is Janet Fanslow. I am a professor at the School of Population Health at the University of Auckland. I think the reason for being at the School of Population Health will probably become clear. Basically, in population health, rather than the one-on-one clinical support, I like to think about it as saying my job is looking after the health of the whole population and looking for big things that influence the health of whole populations. And in particular, my focus has been in the area of understanding violence. So I am going to talk, while I understand that the problem of violence has been going on for quite a lot of years and there's been quite a lot of efforts over millennium, I'm going to talk more over the last couple of decades, even though I've been working in the area. I counted the other day, it's 37 years that I've been working in this area, but I'll just stick with the last couple of decades. So one of the things that I've had the opportunity to do as part of my work has been really about trying to do more about understanding how common violence is in the population as a whole. And I've been able to do this with some fabulous funding from the Health Research Council and from MB to actually conduct 2 different population-based surveys, one in 2003, the other we finished in 2019. And population-based surveys, they don't happen very often. As you can see, there's a long gap, but they're really important because they give us a different perspective on what's going on rather than just looking at people who report to services. You heard Kim talking about the really low rates of people reporting to criminal justice services or to health providers or to refuges. And so when we just count who actually goes to a helping service, we miss a lot of what's going on in the population. So to understand closer to the true prevalence, that's where we look a little bit wider. If the clicker will work. So in the 2 population-based surveys we did, in 2003 we looked across the Auckland and Waikato area. That survey was just looking at women because we were linked into a World Health Organization multi-country study of prevalence at the time. So in 2003 we did a survey of almost 3,000 women between the ages of 18 and 64. When we had the opportunity to do the second survey, the Hei Koe Ora Matapapore study in 2017-2019, we had the opportunity to look across Waikato, Auckland, and Northland. We looked in those areas because that's where about 40% of the population of New Zealand lives, and it's the place you go when you're wanting the most ethnically representative and representative portion of the population. That survey, we also interviewed men about their experiences of violence. I don't have a lot about that in this presentation, but I'm certainly happy to talk more about that when we get to the question time, if you're interested. What that means, though, is that we're working with data from quite a lot of women who form a fairly representative sample of the community as a whole. Okay? So, where do I point the clicker? There we go. To get the data, we literally go door knocking at a random selection of households. We have some criteria to make sure that, that people have been in the area, can respond to questions about neighborhood characteristics, etc. But it is important to know that even though we've talked to a lot of women, there are women who are not included in any of these surveys. So because we go door knocking, we don't talk to women who are homeless. We don't talk to women who are in prisons. We don't talk to women who are in short-term residential housing like boarding houses, etc. And we don't talk to people who don't talk to us, okay? All of that means that probably the people who have the ability to talk to us and are willing to talk to us are the healthiest, happiest, and better resourced and have the time. That's important when we start to understand and think about the rates that we're looking at. There we go. When we reach a kind person who is willing to answer some of the questions in our survey with a whole lot of ethics and safety protocols to make sure that we're interviewing women in private, to make sure that, that there is informed consent, to make sure that there's a whole lot of safety procedures in place before we even start to ask the questions. We do ask women a whole lot of questions about all of these different domains. I think we counted once. If you had to answer every question, you would have had to answer something like 528 questions. We know quite a lot about these women's lives. So I use terms like violence, and I use terms like abuse, and I use and you will have heard in the field things like people who experience physical violence or sexual violence or psychological abuse. And it's important to know that when we ask questions about this in the context of a survey, we actually never use words like violence or abuse, because no one would say that they have experienced violence or abuse. But to make sure that we're really clear with people about what it is we're asking about, we ask about their experience of specific behaviors. So the things that we actually ask about are those questions that you see on your right-hand side, okay? And there's reasons that we do it. Partly it's best practice in a scientific sense, but it also means that when we're comparing rates, say, rates in New Zealand at different times, we know we've asked about the same things, so that we're not just getting a measurement variation. If we're looking at comparative rates across different countries, we know that we've actually used the same questions. And that helps us understand about changes over time or changes or differences across countries. And I suspect you've also noticed that the questions are not light and fluffy. A lot of them include really confronting behaviors. To be counted in the prevalence statistics, what we ask about is, did this specific act happen to you once, ever in your lifetime, by any intimate partner ever? And did it happen once, a few times, or many times? We also ask, did it happen in the last 12 months, which is our measure of, is it a current situation? In addition to physical, sexual, and psychological abuse, we also ask questions about women's experience of economic abuse and experience of controlling behavior. The questions that I'm showing you for economic abuse, those are the two questions about economic abuse that we had in both the 2003 survey and the 2019 survey. In the 2019 survey, we have asked about a few more behaviors, so we have a different understanding of that. And it's always useful to know about when you're thinking about how common is this in the population. So, shall we have a look? All right. So, if we're looking at the prevalence of intimate partner violence against ever-partnered women between the ages of 18 and 64 from the 2003 data, we know that the lifetime rates of women who report experience of physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner ever in their lifetime is 35%. So that's about 1 in 3. And from that 2003 survey, 5% of women reported experiencing one or more of those forms of violence in the last 12 months. So about 1 out of 20. Okay? And before that 2003 survey, we didn't actually know that. So for those of you who can remember back that far, we actually did not know that. It's become kind of a ubiquitous statistic that 1 in 3, right? Everyone rattles it off. Actually, we did not know that before 2003. And when you think about this as affecting maybe 1/3 of the population of women in the country, then you have to start to say, actually, this is a big issue in the population. We also looked at people's experience of, as I mentioned, psychological abuse. The clicker and oopsie. Oh, I turned the whole thing off. That was exciting. Now I have to turn it back on. Which button do I press? Was that you or me? That was me. What do I do to change it back, team? Nobody knows. That's never happened before? That's exciting. All right, I'm gonna, there's magic. You are a magic man. Thank you very much for the rescue, Paul. Okay. So to be conservative, when we were looking at rates of psychological abuse, we looked at, did you experience one or more of those acts, two or more times? So we're still sitting at about 1 in 3 for rates of lifetime sexual abuse. It goes up to about 8% of experience of psychological abuse in the last year. You can see the rates at about economic abuse and controlling behavior ever in your lifetime. Okay. Now, if we're going to look at change over time, because I said we also looked at what happened in 2019, it is kind of useful to think about what actually happened in the intervening years. So I'm going to pull some data from, I've pulled some data for you from the Violence Information Aotearoa, the VINE website, which is the National Information Center on Family and Sexual Violence. If you don't know it, it's a super brilliant resource. But it actually has a timeline about response to family and sexual violence and violence against children. I think it actually goes back to the middle of the 1800s. Okay, fantastic resource. But I'm not going to do the whole timeline for you. All right. So a couple of things about this timeline. I'm not going to go through item by item, but you'll see the timeline running through. If it's red, that's a labor-led government in power. If the line is blue, it's a national-led government in power. And certainly at the start of the 2000s, there was actually, if those of you who remember, that was Helen Clark's labor-led government. There was 3 terms of that government. And there was quite a lot of activity around family and sexual violence. We actually had our first strategy, the Tirito strategy, back in 2002. There was programs set up in Work and Income about responding to family violence and how they as an organization could do it. There was a lot of policy work. 2003, 2004 was when those first statistics landed about the prevalence. And politically, I think that was quite useful. Well, the politicians and a lot of the government officials used it as a really good catalyst to lobby for extra funding, lobby for other things that needed to happen. And it was part that, as well as all of the activities from the NGOs and the community. So that was where we started to see some revitalization of some of the interagency, interministerial government groups about responding to violence. We started to see increased funding in the area with the almost $7 million budget that we hit over in, $70 million budget, about which funded things like the establishment of the Ministry of Health Violence Intervention Program. It's where we started to see the It's Not Okay campaign funded. Down at the bottom, you see the Task Force for Action. And finishing with some of the work around the establishment of the Family Violence Death Review Committee. We also had a strong task force around sexual violence, which then finished in 2009. Kim, I believe, was a lead player in that task force. So, a lot of work, a lot of infrastructure, and I'll pull out some particular programs in a minute. When we look at some of the things that happened in the 2010s, there was probably far less in terms of government investment. We did see a brief pot of funding that came through from the Glenn Inquiry with $80 million that came in. Different forms of work around some different legislation. We did have one new program that came in with the ACC Mates and Dates program, which was actually one of the efforts as a school-based program about trying to teach sexuality and consent education. And even though it was only implemented in a few schools, it was a prevention effort, a serious prevention effort. 2017, we had a change in government again. That was where we started to see a different level of kind of political will. Jan Logie was established as the Undersecretary for Justice with special portfolio responsibilities around family and sexual violence. We didn't even have, she didn't even have a ministerial position, but it was a way to start to get those ideas on the agenda. We also had multiple law changes coming through, and sort of toward the end of 2019, 2020, we had some major investment in the family and sexual violence sector, $320 million that came in 2019. It carried on in 2020, and a few other pieces that you see. Okay, we did see some fallout though in that the Mates and Dates program, the big prevention one that I was talking about, that got disestablished in 2022. Okay, kind of got the context? All right. So the measurement, as I said, happened back in 2019, so we're going to have a look. Oh, no, actually, before we jump there, I want to talk a little bit about 3 programs in particular before we jump to changes. There we go. Who remembers the It's Not Okay campaign? Yeah, okay, a lot of nods. Okay, so that was established in 2007. It was a huge marketing campaign, and it had a really, really ambitious goal. Its goal was around doing a whole social marketing campaign to change all the way all New Zealanders think, act, and respond about family violence, understanding that communities have a whole range of different players. And most people remember the ads because there was national ads, there was ads on billboards, there was radio ads, there was on the ads on buses, etc. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about with this program is that this program had a really sound theoretical basis, and that in addition to all of the national level messaging around it, they actually backed it up with, and they funded 150 community-based action projects to really say, not only is family violence not okay in New Zealand, but it's not okay in Waitakere, it's not okay in Tokoroa. All right, so there was so much of work with the community buy-in, really trying to link in with community champions, local sports people, businesses, anyone who had any, mana and authority who wanted to, whether it was official or unofficial, just because they were a local leader, they could step up on this, and there was room for anybody. And the whole wave was really about family violence is not okay. It is okay to ask for help. And they got a little bit into the stories of positive change before the levels of funding dropped. And it is still a live website. You can see it, but very much a lot of the work is, this is where you can go to get help, and this is where you can go to get help for your particular community. So the flavor of it as a let's change the story doesn't really exist as a common thread. The other program I want to highlight is, again, in 2007, the Violence Intervention Program was established. And many of, I don't know, who knows about the Violence Intervention Program? A few nods? Yeah, not so many. So this is a really important program because this sits within all district health boards across the country. And the goal is saying that health is actually one of the big catchment areas because almost everybody goes through health services at a point in time. They're really trusted, and they have a really important role in the early identification about experiences of violence, the appropriate risk assessment, their referral. And so in 2007, again, it was a great year. I often wish we could have, carried on with 2007, because in 2007 I used to say New Zealand could lead the world on responding to this problem. Because that investment was going in, not only about just saying healthcare providers should step up and do this, but as Kim was mentioning, the importance of the infrastructure to wrap around and support people to do that. Understanding that while individual providers are doing their level best, they need the whole system of support around them. And I think I've already mentioned Mates and Dates. Okay, that one has a start date and an end date. Mates and Dates I thought was a really significant program. It came in with quite a lot of funding from ACC. Again, a really, really sound theoretical basis about saying if we want people to do things other than violence, we need to tell them about healthy relationships. We need to have some opportunities to think about consent. And we need to do this in multiple conversations because it was a 4-year program. It was designed to sit across multiple years of high school. And yes, it wasn't always perfect. Our programs are seldom perfect. But usually what you do in an ideal world with evaluation is you say, this is what we're doing well, this is what we need to work on, and you work on those bits, and you make the whole program stronger. You usually don't throw the whole thing out, but that's kind of what happened. Okay, so lots of work. Lots of effort, lots of NGO activity, which I haven't really talked about. Did it make a difference? Shall we look? Okay, if I can get the clicker. There we go. Okay, changes in prevalence. The light blue bars are 2003, the dark blue bars are 2019. You can see a tiny little change from 35% to 32% in lifetime rates of experience of physical or sexual violence. You can see a really small decrease from 5% to 2% in past 12-month rates of physical or sexual violence. Yep. Any decrease is good, particularly if it's a decrease for you. So any decrease is good. However, these are estimates from a sample. They all have margins of error around them, so we test them and we check if there are any significant changes. There were not any significant changes in rates of physical or sexual violence. We did see, again, no change in lifetime rates of exposure to 2 or more acts of psychological abuse. Small decrease, actually a decent decrease. So our decrease of half in exposure to 12-month experience of psychological abuse. So, a little bit good, probably not enough. The bad news is rates of experience of economic abuse and controlling behavior went up. Okay? So what do we think is going on? Yep.
Changes in the background culture, such as, changes to popular culture or changes to the demographics of the country, something like that?
Yep, could be. These are actually adjusted rates so that we've taken account of any demographic changes and any age changes. It could be kind of a cultural change, but one of the things that we're seeing is that because we're not really seeing any changes in the lifetime rates, we think that actually we really haven't affected perpetration of violence at all. Because we're seeing those small decreases in 12-month rates, we're thinking that a lot of the messaging has been, okay, if you, to a woman, you experience violence, leave. So the lifetime rates don't change, but if she gets the message to leave, then that will reduce the 12-month rate. And if you think about what we've done, we've actually pretty much focused on violence is bad. If you experience it, leave or get help. And if we've done any of the messaging that hits the perpetration level, then actually what we're saying is perpetrating physical or sexual violence might get you in trouble if you're caught. And so if you're going to change your tactics, and you change to things like economic abuse or controlling behavior, because we're far less likely to recognize or prosecute those. Okay, so that's the hypothesis. We did do a little bit of work about trying to check if that idea of relational mobility, if that ability to move out of relationships was different between 2003 and 2019. And we did see a few clues about that in the data. So in 2019, women were reporting that they actually had a greater number of relationships, which could be that they were moving more. Ooh, now we got echo. We also had a higher proportion of women in 2019 who said that they had permanently left an abusive partner. So that gives us a few clues that, that leaving the violent relationship may be affecting it. The other thing that we've got is that, oh, this is kind of a lot of detail. We looked across at the two different time periods about risk factors for perpetration, risk factors for victimization. Those are the bars in red. And we looked at things around that might be protective factors. The upshot of it is that in 2003 and in 2019, some of the background factors have not really changed. For perpetration or for victimization, it's really about having previous experience of violence in your life, either as a perpetrator or as a victim. So that background lifetime experience or exposure to violence as a child is still a problem. In 2019, we saw a few changes where there was some slight increase in protective factors around better education, both for women and men. We also saw that there was a slight decline in the number of children available in the household, which actually increases people's ability to move. It's the economic factor. It's easier to move when you have fewer children. Okay, so you'll have your own conclusions from this. I look at this and I say, we have violence that is far too common. We know that it has a big fallout. We know that we have done a lot of things, but we probably haven't necessarily, even with all of the activity and the best will in the world, we haven't really made the changes that we would like to see. So, the other thing that I want to point out, though, is that we have made a really significant effort about building the infrastructure. And that work, we're seeing small changes, and we don't ever want to discount small changes. And we know that that is off the back of incredibly important work from the community sector and indeed from the government. But it doesn't mean the fact that we haven't made the substantial changes that we want doesn't mean we need to throw those services out with the bathwater. It actually means we need to sustain them. We need to fund them better rather than just the kind of 2% or tiny proportions of funding that the services get of really uneven funding. So because we often fund services and response services on the idea that it's just happening to a few people, right? And so we fund them as if they just need a shoestring, when in fact we have a population-based issue. The big point, of course, is also that in addition to funding all of the services to respond, we actually need to think seriously about prevention. And can we do more about preventing violence before it stops, before it starts? We definitely want it to stop. And I think we need to do more. I think we need to sharpen the saw, as it would, to actually focus a little bit more, more clearly about things that might make a difference. I am not alone in thinking this. So this was some quotes from an office of the review that the Office of the Auditor General did about family and sexual violence work over over a decade. And some of their key themes were: there is a lack of systems analysis and strategic approaches, and those do not receive the long-term funding that they need. And that we do need some more systematic knowledge building. And we do need to actually get people to think about this as a problem that evidence can help with. Because at the moment, we are often at the mercy of there is urgent need, and we are trying to respond to the urgent need as best we can, which means we're peddling all the time. But we actually need to look at some of the evidence about what is the cut through and what will move us forward. Which raises the question of, what can we do, right? We think about this as an entrenched problem. It's going to take decades and generations to change. But actually, we need to understand that there is a global effort happening around about understanding prevention, with far more investment than we have been able to marshal, and far more resources and thinking and strategy. So there's a brilliant website, which I don't think many people know about. It's called the What Works to Prevent Violence. It's a huge program, which has been in existence for a couple of decades now. They've got evidence-based programs that actually really do lead to prevention. The World Health Organization has put together a whole set of technical packages around preventing violence against children, which talk about things like economic supports. They talk about things like parenting packages. They talk about 7 key strategies, all of which have really, really good evidence behind them. But we're not using them to invest or move ourselves forward. And this is a problem when we look at some of those programs and some of the effectiveness of these programs. So this is a program out of Uganda. It's the SAZA program. I talk about it all the time. Because in 4 years, in a community-based program, they were able to achieve a 52% reduction in perpetration of intimate partner violence. 4 years, they cut that perpetration rate in half. This is not necessarily an intergenerational problem if we don't wish it to be. But we need to be prepared to learn and understand that we're part of even though we're working in a unique context, and yes, we need to package things and adjust them, and make sure they fit here, but there's a lot that we could be doing to change the story. It will take actions across all of the different sectors of the system, whether it's health, whether it's justice, whether it's government, but we really can do it if we want to. Are we choosing to make that spend at the moment? This is from the last couple of years. Okay, with really devastating financial cuts across the sector. And I worry about this because we already know that we're spending a lot of money on the problem. So it's not just that we don't have the money, it's that we're already spending the money on the fallout from this. And we might need to choose to invest more wisely. And people talk, in my field, I also work in the area about mental health promotion, and we talk about the need for a strong research base. We talk about the need for creative and effective practice, and we talk about needing strong government policy and public participation. And I guess sometimes I have the question about where is our public call for saying we need something really, really different here. We need the cross-party agreements that Kim was talking about. This shouldn't be a political football. It should be something that's intrinsic to all of the work that we do. And we don't have to look very far to see across the ditch what people are doing. In Australia, this is an image from, some of the giant public protests which have been happening in Australia over the last few years. Some upwards of 1 million people marching saying, we need to do better about responding to family and domestic violence. So we could use that buy-in here to think about ways of moving forward, because it's a problem we don't have to have. I think that's enough for me for now. Thanks.
I think you'll agree. We're getting some pretty good material to use in our own conversations, in our own personal politics, and our own advocacy in the communities that we work with. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the last speaker, Professor Denise Wilson, who has been addressing this issue from the point of view of the plight of whānau and children, Māori children in particular, as victims of violence. Welcome, Denise. And thank you, Janet. I don't know what I said.
Right, can you hear me? Kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi mahana kia koutou. Ko waio, hea uri aho, tainui, Ngāti Porou kia Heratonga, whakatoa hea Ngāti Oni mea, Ngāti tū wharetoa, ko Denise Wilson aho. I predominantly work as a researcher in the area of Māori health, and I've been very fortunate to have two big research programs that I've been undertaking, so have got to sit with some of our the whānau who call themselves sitting on the margins of the margins, and really hear and listen to what life is like for them and the realities that they're living through, and to also listen to their hopes and aspirations for their tamariki, for their mokopuna. And I guess that's where I want to start. So today, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the musings and reflections that I've had as we close up our Kei Roto Tō Tātou Rongoa project that really built on our E Tū Wahine, E Tū Whānau study that looked at Māori women keeping safe and unsafe relationships. And then this one was like, the answers lie within us. So going back to whānau around what some of those solutions do they see would make a difference in their lives. And so it's been a pretty amazing project to be part of. We went to 7 sites across Aotearoa over 3 years and conducted day-long wānanga. And we worked with Māori providers who worked with us in terms of recruiting participants. So at the end of it, we've spoken to 214 whānau members and kaimahi, who most of them have lived experience of family and sexual violence. So, but I also want to start this talk around being mindful that not all our whānau have violence in their lives, but nevertheless, Māori women and children are most likely, 3 times more likely, to experience serious assault requiring hospitalisation and die as a result of a family violence related homicide. And our tamariki I think it's about 4 times more likely to die than non-Māori children. So this is a real issue. I don't quite know how I fell into doing research in this area, but this is where I've been for a number of years. So I thought we were doing really well. There'd been a lot of good changes made. We've got the Minister for the Prevention of Family and Sexual Violence. We've got, some really good things happening, particularly over COVID. Every week we attended meetings and what have you about how, people needed to respond or what are some of the prevention things that are going on. So, where's the... So, imagine thinking that we're making really positive progress, albeit not fast enough as far as I'm concerned, but we're making better progress and looking at how we can respond better to our Indigenous people here in Aotearoa. And then no, I need to go back one more. And then there's this dramatic shift in political ideology. And I think, we can always think about having the swings, the highs and the lows and what have you, when we get new governments and what have you. But, I think a writer that I quite like is Monboy, who talks a lot about neoliberal ideology. And he says that no matter what governments, and whether it's more left-leaning or whether it's more right, that we still have the neoliberal narrative that underpins everything that we do. And I get that the economy is really important, but our children, our mokopuna and our tamariki in Aotearoa, whether they're Māori or not, are really important to be looking after. So, I've really looked at thinking about, how do we get our tamariki mokopuna into the centre of the decision making. And I was really inspired. I've been fortunate for the last 2 years to go to the UK Academy of Medical Sciences, improving child health in developed countries, and listening to the people from Singapore, where they realised one day, similar sort of population sizes, Aotearoa, that if we don't start rethinking about what we're doing, we're only a small country and we're in big trouble if we don't start focusing our attention on our tamariki and mokopuna. And so now every decision that's made, whether it's roading, whether it's construction, whatever, has children at the centre. And I think, we could have a lot to learn from that. But, at the moment, my concern about the ideology that exists at the moment is it's very individualistic in its approach. And family violence is a really complex issue at the best of times. But for Indigenous people like Māori, there are layers of additional complexity that exist. And there's a lot of evidence to say that within our whānau and hapu, violence was not condoned. In fact, anybody who transgressed the norms was dealt with quite swiftly and harshly. So, it's like, how do we get to where we are today? And we've got this big intergenerational problem with a portion of our whānau in this country. And I was a co-author of the People's Report out of the Glen Inquiry with Professor Melinda Weber. And, one of the things that I came away from that was, if you don't know what you don't know, you do what you do know. And what you do know is not the best, but you do it anyway. And I just get reminded of this time and time again when I listen to the whānau that I've been working with, that they don't have any skills in their kete to draw upon. And so one of the tāne who had spent many, many years in prison for violence and for, drug stuff and what have you, he said to me, Denise, this was the only thing I had in my kete. He said, I had to learn new things. He said, it doesn't mean to say it doesn't still exist in there, but he said, I've got other things now and I can make choices. And I think for our whānau, their choices are limited at times. Their choices are limited by a lack of information. We've developed a uplift pathway which has all the information that our whānau need, because when you have your babies taken from you in the middle of the night by a large number of police and social workers, and you don't know who to ring, and nobody gives you any information for months and months, it's really hard. And once the baby's gone, it's a very hard road to try and get them back. That's a whole other story that I could talk about, but what have you. And the other thing that I worry about is that framing of race-based politics. We've conflated race and need, but call it race. And, we know that Māori are high need in a number of areas of social, education, health, violence. There's a lot of need there. I don't know what Janet thinks, but from a population perspective, when you can get groups of your population, you can target interventions that are a lot more tailored to what their needs are. And but because we say, oh no, we're all one people, and everybody needs to get access to the same thing, the reality is that even by naming Māori as a high needs, they still don't get the same as other people in the population. So it's one of those really vexed issues, and that political football is something that I think should be, somebody should puncture the football really, so that everybody gets on and starts working together on this problem. And yes, we'll have some ideological differences about how we go about it, but if we don't, the consequence is that our tamariki and mokopuna are at the bottom of the scrum, and nobody's thinking about what's best for them. So this study that we did really was underpinned by this whakatauki ko te Māori, he mea huna e te moana. So, when you look at the sea and it's quite dark and you can't really see the things below it, and I can remember going snorkelling at Great Barrier Reef, and it was like, I think I nearly drowned because it was like, oh my gosh. This is what I see on TV, and these fish are are right in front of me. I think things are about a matter of recognising that there are some really positive things, and we've learnt some amazing things in the last 3 to 4 years with our whānau about what they're doing. So I think, going back and thinking about that is really, really important. That their complexities of their lives often are focused on without looking at their aspirations, the strengths that they have. We found that Māori women in our keeping safe and unsafe relationship studies had an amazing range of strategies to keep and try and protect their children. Admittedly, from the outside looking in, you could think, what are they doing? But they know their environment, they know the context, they are clued into changes in their partner's behaviours and things like that. The problem is that there's a major lack of response when they need help. So we learnt that they couldn't, if they pluck up the courage to dial 111, they cannot guarantee that they're going to get a response from the police. And that's the reality. We've heard that so many times. And that's not helpful. And yet people will say, well, she could have left, or she could have, asked for help. One of the things when I was on the Deaf Review Committee was these women asked multiple people, multiple times for help. The irony is that people document it, but they don't do anything about it. And that's the sad part. And the really sad part was that we were looking at people who ended up dead. So we need to start rethinking all of that, and because Māori women and children are laced with a lot of judgment and bias and what have you. So, not only do they have to try and navigate a very fragmented and siloed system that still exists in that way, despite good intentions of getting government agencies to work in a more collaborative way, where any door should be the right door, and that people will be sent to the right people if you're not the right person, that they've come through your door. That doesn't exist, and it's something that's, that we could look at. There's some amazing work going on by kaupapa Māori providers around this country. They do amazing work. They're totally underfunded, and always at risk of having funding pulled. So we need to, as Janet talked about, rather than focusing on individuals, we need to look at the system and how the system responds to those who are in a time of really great need. So here's a question that I've been asking for the last 12 months. When do we start putting tamariki and mokopuna at the centre of what we do? When do we say that they're really important? I have not yet one whānau that doesn't want the best for their children, but they are compromised significantly by not enough money, food security, insecurity, housing insecurity. Oh my gosh, this time we found out that things are actually really worse, particularly around emergency housing. And that's a whole other session that we could go into with this. But, our government says they've they reduced remarkably over half of the people in emergency housing, down to 1,500. Just like that. So that prompted me to ask everywhere I went, so where are the women that were in emergency housing? They are homeless, they are living in their cars, or they're couch surfing. And I think, when them and their children come out of violent relationships, they need space. They need space to settle, to get on their feet again and orientate with the world, and then look at how they're going to go forward. Most of the women that we've interacted with, they want to do better. They aspire to go and get a second chance at education. They want to be good role models for their kids because they don't want them to go through what they've been through. But we need to be able to say, okay, so what do they need and how can we give them that space to keep them settled? So what we heard was when they don't have some stability, you know, when somebody says, well, you have to move out at 4 o'clock because it's lunchtime because nobody's paid for your accommodation, they have to shift. And that means that they can't hold a job down often because they go to a different part, particularly in Auckland, you get put in a different part of Auckland. The transport is not sufficient. But their children can't go to school because they're not, A, they don't have an address, but they're not in a stable area. So, you know, we're very quick in this country to blame them, but we actually need to start understanding how sometimes the system doesn't help them. And they do need help, because the other thing that we found in this study, even though we're looking at all these good things, was that they're a whānau of one. So because of their circumstances, because of the violence, maybe because of the alcohol and the, you know, drugs and what have you, over time their whānau have pulled away. But what we've found too is that the government agencies have put a wedge in between them. So when they ask for help, their form of support is the government agencies, ironically. So we need to think about that as well, and what have you. You know, and, you know, how do we dismantle public good? Well, we blame the system and break it. So, you know, there's some good things that have been going on that have been stopped. We frame the failure and blame it. We offer a market solution and sell things. We privatise and deregulate. And we normalise this cycle, erasing the memory of how it started in the first place. So I think, you know, that system analysis is really important. So the current landscape within which, you know, violence for our whānau Māori exists is such that it makes them invisible and it silences them. And they feel like they don't have a voice, which is really quite sad. And I also just want to mention too that we can't forget our tāne, our men, because they're in a similar situation. And in our Keeping Safe and Unsafe Relationships study, more than 80% of the women in it still had contact with their children's father because they were committed to maintaining their whakapapa. You know, and so sometimes that meant that they made decisions that was to their detriment and people thought was unsafe. I can give you lots of stories about that as well. But the other thing that we need to talk about is social and systemic entrapment. And so I talk about systemic entrapment in our Keeping Safe and Unsafe Relationships study. But we've been doing some work with Professor Julia Tolmie, who's a criminal law professor at University of Auckland, and Rachel Smith, who has been in this area for many years around systemic and social entrapment, because it's a form of violence as well. So while we have partners who engage in coercive controlling behaviour and entrap their partners in relationships, making it difficult for them to just leave, and we know that at the time of leaving and afterwards is an incredibly risky time for women and children where they're at heightened risk of a family violence related homicide. So, you know, we need to be understanding the intersectional things, the state-sanctioned violence, but also the infrastructure around colonial violence that's created this situation for Māori as well. We need to look at the realities of the family violence safety responses that are available. You know, I've just been doing some work with some women in prison and just come away thinking, you know, A, where were the big people who should have been here protecting them as children? And B, nobody in all their time helped them. They were left to their own designs to work out how they're going to solve the problems that they were in with no support. And the other one is understanding a partner's abusive, coercive control, because from the outside looking in, they look like good guys sometimes, because some of that stuff is really subtle. And none of these women go into relationships with a violent person. It happens over time. For some, it happens quite quickly. For others, it's a long time. So it's subtle, it creeps up, and by the time they realise they've got a problem, it becomes very difficult. And, you know, we found that silence, isolation and compliance are safety strategies. At times, you know, like they go to court and then they won't say anything and they withdraw. Partly because it takes so long, but partly because too, they know if they don't, there are consequences. So there are all those things. So, you know, I have to go back to our question. I just want to say that for our project, Jordan Tani, who's a young communication design student, has done all the artwork and what have you. And I really love this pepe because it just really is a reminder that there's the fire within inside of us. The flame might be only little for a lot of our wahine and in our tamariki, but it exists. But it needs kindness and caring and support. And I guess I just want to leave with a message from our participants for the study that we've just finished. They said, you've got to be our voice and you need to advocate for us. Well, a bit of a problem with my spelling there, but you know, it's really true because nobody listens to them, they're silenced. Yeah, and so if you want to know more about our study, there's a QR code I've had to get with the real world, with QR codes with this. So yeah, so ngā mihi nui, kia koutou, e tēnei wā. Thank you.
Any questions from the audience? Thank you so much. Denise, for that address. Thank you so much. Can we have the lights? I've got the gadget here. I think they'll work. Bring it towards you.
Thank you so much, panellists, for the excellent presentation. Yes, I really enjoyed that. Each of you painted a really clear picture of the fluctuation of funds which were available to various programs which were then cut with changes of government. I'm not thinking of the big charities with my question, but is there a sense of continuity which is provided from the philanthropic sector financially which stabilises that wave of funding at all?
I'm just going down.
You'll pass this one around. You keep that one in the audience and we'll pass this one between the speakers.
I'm just going down that path at the moment and I just haven't had the time to do that, but it's on my to-do list. and I have had some initial discussions, and I think that is something that we can do, because out of our project we've produced this range of resources for our whānau. They come in a box, but they're expensive to produce, and we've produced quite a few that go to the providers and whoever came to our symposium. But that's one way that philanthropic agencies can then look at supporting things like this. And these resources are about kaimahi and whānau being a little bit self-sufficient in some of the things, and they have a range of things, to cards that stimulate discussions around what finance is, and I'm always amazed at the conversations that come out of that. Some pathways, how to get a protection order, how to get an if your tamariki's been taken, what are your rights? What's the process? So we've done all that, and everything has been back out to them a couple of times as we've developed them. But yeah, I think you're right. Philanthropic is one avenue, but yeah, it's pretty hard. And I think there's some good things being done by some iwi as well.
Thanks, Denise.
Can I just add, I think it's actually really difficult to get a handle on the actual funding for this sector. I think there's some projects going on at the moment to try and even understand what level of government funding goes into different programs. But in some of the, just because they're funded in kind of piecemeal ways through a lot of different funding strands at government levels. Maybe 10 years or so ago, there was some work about trying to understand the spend related to prevention. And I think they worked out that it was maybe less than 2% of the available funding for the family and sexual violence sector. My understanding is that there's a new project where they are trying to get a better understanding of government spend in the area. But at the moment, there is not a process for understanding what is the philanthropic donation line in there. And it's also, I think, particularly difficult because some of it's philanthropic, but some of it actually comes from community-based level. And if you actually think about how, it's the old, let's fund this through a bake sale, right? It's buy a white ribbon, it's small donations, it's, donate your $2 coin to Refuge on the Day. So I think it's really, really hard to try and get a handle on that level of community support. But for me, it also goes back to, while that support signals that the community thinks it's important and that philanthropics think it's important, it's still hard to get it at the systemic level that we need for something that is so deeply entrenched across so many of our systems.
Thanks, Janet.
There's another question of yours.
Yes. Hello. Kim, I'm very interested in your idea of a lawyer representing a victim, but I'm a bit puzzled about what the lawyer would do, because as I understand it, I'm not an expert anyway, if the defendant chooses not to take the stand, the prosecution wouldn't cross-examine the defendant, and the lawyer for the victim wouldn't have a role to play either.
Yeah.
So I can understand the lawyer would be useful for support and advice, but that would be about it, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. On the Chief Victims Advisor website, one of the reports that I commissioned was looking at legal representation across the similar jurisdictions, and places like Ireland and other sort of common jurisdictions, have trialled some parts of just advice, as you mentioned. So when a woman, for example, is having her phone taken off her by the police, sometimes women feel that they're digitally strip searched, but they've got nobody to advise them whether they're allowed to, whether they're allowed to, what parameters around what information is taken out of their phone, phones and things like that. That's just one example, but there are some pilots across the world where they've had different representation for those particular parts.
So it is an idea that's been tried?
Oh, absolutely. Across the world, right. There are a number of pilots that have been started and trialled. Sometimes they stop and start, like here as well. But,
thank you.
Yeah. No, but thanks for the question.
Just a comment on that last one for a start, that in family court, of course, you have a counsel for the child who represents the interests of the child. It would, of course, need legislative change too, but that could be one role for the victim support lawyer. But my question was really, it's obvious from what you've all said, is that the changes of political leadership have been extremely detrimental to the whole level, from the legislative thing down to the community level, because of the funding changes and so on. If you were to try and put forward an idea for bipartisan, well, it's not as multi-partisan, of course, now, agreement, what do you think would be a kind of minimum that the multi-parties that we have, some of which may not last that long, would agree to? I know that's a hard one, but are there sort of some kernels there that you might get that sort of agreement for?
I think there's some fundamental principles that should underpin that sort of relationship. It's like the importance of women and children. If we've truly put our tamariki, mokopuna, into the centre, we also then need to look at what supports, wraparound supports, do we put for whoever's parenting them. Sometimes it's the dads, because I always tell the story about she won't like it, but my daughter used to ring me up with these medical alert, because I've got a nursing background, medical alert calls. So I get this medical alert, and she said, my moko, was 4 or 5 months old, fell off the bed on her head. So we go through all the things, does she need to go to the hospital now? Does, look, all of that, what you need to look for, and this is what you've got to do if this happens. And then I said to her, so how come she fell off the bed? And there was just this silence. And she said, maybe she's learnt something about gravity. And I'm on the other end of the phone thinking, oh my gosh. And I said to her, maybe you can go with that she's learnt nothing about gravity, and that you could put her on the floor next time if you have to urgently go somewhere. And it really got me thinking that we just make these assumptions about what parents know. And, I think, I had my mum around, and she'd say, do you want to be doing that in 6 months' time? Or, you need to be thinking about this. And a lot of our whānau don't have that. But they have their baby, and next minute, and they might have, caesarean section, they might have had a really rough labour, and they can be out within 24, 48 hours. So who teaches them things? And my daughter said to me, they didn't tell us in antenatal classes that they wriggle when you try to put nappies on them. And it's just little things like that get you thinking, and you think, these are really key things that we're not actually equipping our new parents with. So we expect them to be model citizens and model parents, but we haven't given them the tools and the knowledge and the skills to do that job well. And, I think when I had my babies, I was in hospital 7 to 10 days and, looked after, taught all these things and what have you. But we don't have that. So I think there's some fundamental things that would underpin it. So, what would a healthy whānau look like? And then so what do we need to agree to get there? Because for some of our whānau, there is no primary prevention space for them. They're born into, violence and what have you. So that healing has to go alongside of prevention. They need to go hand in hand. So I think, having the parties having a really good understanding of what family violence is all about in the first place, because I'm always stunned at the people who are working with our whānau who don't understand the dynamics of it, how complex it is, the system responses or non-response, things like that. So I think some of those things should be fundamental principles that are agreed upon, but you have to get them in a room and they have to be able to get some sort of consensus decision making. Yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question, but yeah, I don't think it's simple.
Look, I think when Janet was talking about the 1 in 3 women who've experienced some form of violence, and we know that about 1 in 4 girls experience sexual violence before they're teenagers, and 1 in 6 to 8 boys. These are phenomenal rates of violence in our communities everywhere. Our rates of suicide, youth suicide, male suicide. We need governments to have this cross-party support and a focus on ending violence. And I loved the Ghanaian program. Oh, Uganda, was it? Yeah. Uganda. Of ending, of halving violence in, was it 4 or 5 years? 4 years, yeah. So I think, when you've got evidence like that, we can do it. We just have to have the will and the determination and putting violence at the front of everything to end it. I'll give it to you.
I agree with what the wise women to my right have said. I would also alter it slightly. So I think we actually need agreement that relationships, healthy and well-functioning relationships of all kinds, are fundamental to the health, well-being, and economic well-being and productivity of our country. Because I know that those are buzzwords that matter to people, but I also think that they're true. I think that means if we're going to prioritize quality of relationships, that we need to then actually have some sustained investment in some particular pieces to try and move us forward on that. So I do think we need the prevention and the promotion work really probably at school level and universally at school, all schools, and developmentally across the whole life course of children's time in schools about what quality relationships are, how we behave with each other. Because don't hit your friend and steal their toy, it's fine at, that's what they need to know at 2 or 3, but actually that, they need to know that at 14 and at 17 as well. And if you start it young, you can then develop it about those messages. You don't do that with your friends, with your mates. How does that work when you're going into an intimate relationship? So I think that needs to be a fundamental in terms of our prevention piece. It needs to be well funded, it needs to be universal, it needs to be long term. I completely agree with Denise about the long-term recovery with the rates that we're talking about, and understanding that we do carry burdens of intergenerational trauma through colonization and everything else. We need to have a far bigger piece about recovery from trauma and what that means and who has a piece of that. And anyone can have a piece of that, whether they're your neighbor, whether they're somebody, whether they're a counselor, but we need to start recognizing it and thinking about how we build it into our systems. I do push the health response because health, I think, has a key role in terms of that early identification, risk assessment, and referral, and we need that because that's another universal strand. And I think that, again, Denise's line, or if you looked at the INSPIRE program, which is the technical packages about prevention of violence against children, which the World Health Organization and other key players have endorsed. They talk about the parental supports, they talk about the economic supports for families, and they talk about the norms change around behavior. So they have 7 different strands, all of which have a really, really good evidence base. So I think we need to use that as a rudder to help us steer and say, we are all going to commit to it because we're all in this together.
I just think, with Janet touching on the intergenerational violence and trauma and the historical things, but also we can't underestimate the whole thing around contemporary socio-economic deprivation that a lot of our whānau are living with. And, I'm always amazed at how resourceful our whānau are, but actually they shouldn't have to be that resourceful. We know that even a small amount of time for children living in poverty has lifetime health and social effects. So, I mean, if we're talking about, safeguarding the economy of the country, we have to be serious about safeguarding the safety and well-being of our future generations. And I think that's really critical. One of the things that that we've found in the research that we're doing is the strengthening of people's identity and who they are, and cultural connection are really pivotal things in a lot of whānau starting on a healing journey. That journey's not going to be like, a state highway in the North America where you can, see it in the distance. It's going to be all over the place. And I think we have to expect that. And our whānau say, we need to be able to drop in and out of counselling or support like that when we need it, because this is not going to be fixed in 6 or 10 sessions. So I think we need to take those things into account, and we need to look at, what are the things that we put in place to help the healing, and the other thing that I think we need to recognise is that for substance misuse in the presence of family violence and trauma is a way of it's a form of self-medication. When your reality is pretty, I don't know if I'm allowed to say crappy, then sometimes you just want to block it out. But one of the unfortunate side effects of that is that some people end up with addiction, so that becomes another thing, as part of their healing to do. So we need to recognise that, this is just not straight binge drinking because of what have you. This is a self-medication thing oftentimes. And the other thing is the mental health things. The anxiety, the depression, the things are normal reactions to being in an unpredictable and at times dangerous situations, and trying to monitor and navigate and keep your tamariki safe is really difficult at times. So I think that we need to recognise the things that outsiders don't see, but that exist within our whānau, and start looking at some of the positive things rather than all the deficits.
Tēnā koutou katoa.
There's a question at the back. Sorry, I'll give it back to you.
Kia ora. Thank you for your presentations. I was interested to hear your thoughts about how violence is approached or responded to in the courts. So obviously physical violence comes under the criminal system, and psychological violence is under the family court. And obviously I can see there's a sort of a lower burden of proof in the family court, but it's private and it has to be privately funded by the victims. And then the state and the criminal system will carry the prosecution. What are your views on that, or the evidence-based responses that work best, do you think?
It's very clear that we need much more sharing of information between the district courts, which is criminal courts, and family courts. And we have huge problems for victims, survivors, in both, like the district courts, but also the family courts. And I mean, organisations like the Backbone Collective have reported women getting stuck in the family court for decades while their children are growing up, and processes being used against them. Courts and processes being weaponised against women to bankrupt them, and and then I had some women talk to me about children who were feeling they were forced to have supervised visits with abusive fathers, in this case, and one 5-year-old boy vomiting all the way in the car to the supervised access, but they're forced to go. So I don't think we have very good risk assessment tools across justice or family courts. While I was working with principal family court judge, I know she was looking at the pilot program in Australia that I brought to her attention, and I was really pleased that she went to have a look at it, and that was the Lighthouse Project. And it was having a group of experts in family violence, sexual violence, being able to have a look at the victim survivors and all the material that came before the court, but having specialists help the judges to work through the very complex material that comes forward. Judges are lawyers, and they're trained in law, but we need people from Refuge and Rape Crisis to help unpack some of the material that comes into court that is not really very well understood, I don't think.
Can I just say, yeah, and I think you just sort of touched on it, around the mental health aspects. We should be able to put our hands up and ask for help when we need it, without fear that it's going to be used against us. So, if we're feeling a little bit depressed or anxious or having panic attacks or something like that, people should be able to go and ask for help and be assured that it's going to be private. But I'm always astounded how the defence get hold of a woman's mental health records And I say that because as a nurse consultant, trying to get information on mental health services when we had one of their patients in the acute medical unit was like getting blood out of a stone. And privacy was the issue. But put it in the court setting and it just seems like the books are open and defence lawyers can take whatever they want. And so I think we need to, shift some of those things a little bit, because what I observe happening is then it's misconstrued, it's twisted, and women are made to look incompetent, and they feel helpless and they can't fight it. Because if they do fight it, it's like, see, we told you. So it's unfair, and it's certainly not just.
I think we'll leave it there. I think we've had an amazingly interesting night. I think we've had incredible speakers. Can I say that our numbers may be small in this room, but I have heard that there is quite an audience out there in YouTube land that are picking this up, including the local MP, Helen White, has been listening into this conversation, and so I think that's one of your little direct routes to civic society.
Before you close,
Yeah.
I do just have a one more point. Can I throw it in?
Fine.
Since I've got an audience. I actually just want to pick up on some of Denise's points about the economics of it. And I think there's a ton of analysis out of the 2019 study which is available, including a piece around women's experience of economic abuse. And what we were really seeing was that had when economic abuse kicks in, it has a super compounding effect for women's mental health and for their likelihood of long-term health consequences. But also one of the critical pieces for them to leave violent relationships, they actually then needed a job and a viable job. So this is one of, back to your question, Julie, it's also about understanding the whole economic substrate of it. And it is an issue where even things like pay equity legislation has a real systemic effect on the whole system. And the final comment I want to make is, again, linking into something that Denise said about the mental health effects. But the other thing we're seeing now, with the data from the 2019 study, we were able to link it into the National Hospitalization Database over the last 31 years. And so what we're seeing is that people who have lifetime experience of violence, whether it's child sexual abuse, violence by non-partners, intimate partner violence. For women, they have increased risk of hospitalization for cancer, for digestive disorders, for respiratory diseases, for pregnancy complications, etc. And so this is a systemic problem that's sitting under a lot of all of the other problems that we talk about as a country: physical health problems, mental health problems, criminal justice problems. So if we really want to get the systemic change, we do need to address it head on. Now I'm done.
Thanks, Janet. Yes, so in winding up, my point about an MP listening in is really about the fact that this is got to be debated in a political environment, and we have got to take this debate into the places where I think we can pick up on the slide that Denise showed us, whereby we undermine the common good. We undermine debate about what is the common good and the good in society that is necessary and available to us, if only we don't have those undermining influences of saying that it can be marginalised, it can be sold off, it can be diminished in significance and so on. And as Janet's just pointed out, if we're talking about family violence, it's also expressing, a lot of these issues are expressing themselves in rates of bowel cancer, in rates of poverty, in rates of nutritional problems at school, and in failure to thrive in a school environment. So it's a big issue about the nature of our civic society and the way in which we work. And I actually go to the point that you made too, Bernadette, about how the structure of our NGO sector has to be strengthened in order to make them feel robust enough to be able to not just do their job, but do their job in the smallest of the community that they can impact with, which is not to say they are one thing for all people. A lot of the NGOs have got to be specific agencies in specific regional locations and contexts, dealing with specific members of whānau who have specific issues, whether it's to do with the point that Denise is making about an addiction in one place, or it's to do with a contaminated water supply in another place. The NGO sector in New Zealand has got to become an active and prolific organisation. And can I just finish by saying, and that is why the Fabian Society exists. We are an organisation that tries to promote the progressive and common civic society integrity of our country and the need for it to be defended, to be advocated for, to be reformed, and then for those reforms to be bedded in so they don't get taken away from us from another ideological shift that we might have had in an election result. So I congratulate you all for being here. I congratulate the MP for plugging in. I congratulate the speakers for being such a powerful group of advocates for what we asked them to talk about tonight, and for giving us ammunition to take away and use in our own conversations and our own networks. Thank you very much for coming. Fabians you can belong to by just getting on their website and donating any sum of money you think of. In fact, you could even double the sum of money you can think of, and we'd still accept it because we wish to continue. Good night, and thank you very much. And thank you to the tech staff.